Inside a luxury furniture showroom, the cashier looked up smiling. "That'll be $30,000. My son dug through his pockets and grinned. "Dad, I forgot my wallet again." My daughter-in-law laughed. "Mine's in the car too. You've got this right." The salesman's eyes settled on me. I kept my smile easy. "Funny thing, I forgot mine too." Their faces froze. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories. Glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, I'd love for you to follow along so you never miss one. Before we go further, I want to ask whatever corner of the world you're sitting in right now. What's the weather like? Sometimes the sky outside sets the mood for the kind of story we're about to hear. One more thing, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. At 69, I stood in that gleaming showroom, watching the digital display climb to $30,000 while my son smiled at me, the way he'd been smiling for the past 3 years. The Scandinavian leather sectional caught the track lighting just so every cushion set with showroom precision. My son, Dalton, 39, and dressed in the careful business casual of a sales manager, drew his hand along the armrest, the way someone does when they've never had to scrimp for anything. Beside him, Sable Fenwick. My 35-year-old daughter-in-law, the real estate agent who'd somehow never figured out how to manage her own finances, pushed her designer sunglasses up and tipped her chin toward the matching love seat. "But this one," Dalton said. "Definitely this one." They'd already settled on the walnut dining table, the crystal chandelier, the hand-knotted rug that cost more than my first truck. I'd spent 30 years building homes across San Antonio, alongside my late wife Noreen, and the last 3 years watching my only son bleed dry the retirement the two of us had worked so hard to build. The young clerk Soren Bledsoe smiled with professional ease, tallying the order on his tablet, completely unaware he was about to witness the end of a 3-year arrangement. The Scandinavian leather sectional, the Brandt dining table, the Murano glass chandelier, and the Tabriz rug. Soren read it off his finger moving across the screen. "That brings your total to $30,247. Dalton's didn't flinch. He never did. Instead, he turned to me, wearing that same easy grin, the one that said, "Dad will cover it." "Dad, I left my wallet again." He patted his pockets in a routine I'd watched play out dozens of times. "You don't mind, do you?" Before I could say a word, Sable touched his arm with well-rehearsed timing. "Oh goodness, mine's still in the car." Her voice was breezy with manufactured surprise. "We're all over the place today." They both looked at me. Soren looked at me. The whole showroom went quiet in spite of the soft classical music playing through hidden speakers. Yeah, I smiled. "Funny thing," I said, "I forgot mine too." For 3 seconds no one moved. Dalton's grin locked in place. Sable's hand went still on his arm. Soren's finger hovered above the tablet screen. "What?" Dalton said. "My wallet," I said, steady as I could be. "Must have left it at home. Happens to everybody." I turned for the exit. My work boots made no sound on the polished marble floor. Behind me, I caught Sable's sharp breath, the start of Dalton's protest, Soren's baffled murmur about holding the order. I kept walking, through the automatic doors across the parking lot into my truck. I never looked back. The drive home ran 20 minutes. I switched on the radio, then clicked it off again. The quiet felt right. Clean. I pulled into my driveway, walked through the front door I'd hung myself 15 years ago, and headed straight to my home office. The room carried the smell of old wood and the lemon oil I used on the desk Noreen had found at an estate sale in 1997. I settled into my chair, opened the laptop, and brought up my bank account. 3 years of statements laid out in front of me. I'd never put them all side by side before. Never wanted to see the whole shape of it. But now, I clicked through month by month, methodically credit card charges, wire transfers, cash withdrawals, Dalton's house down payment. $25,000. He'd told me it was a loan that he'd pay me back within 6 months. That was 34 months ago. Sable's car insurance. $400 a month, 18 months, $7,200. Their cell phone bills on my family plan. $160 a month, 3 years, $5,760. Furniture, vacations, birthday parties. The new roof on their house, Dalton's dental work, Sable's conference in Nashville, the anniversary dinner at the Chop House where the wine list started at $200 a bottle. How many years had this been going on? How many times had I heard that same forgotten wallet line? I opened a spreadsheet and began adding. Line by line, charge by charge. The number rolled past $50,000, then $80,000, then $100,000. I kept going. $120,000, $140,000. My hand went still on the mouse when the final figure settled into the total cell, $160,000. I leaned back and stared at it. The afternoon light came through the blinds and dusty bars across my desk. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, a car door shut. Life rolling forward like nothing had shifted, but something had. I took a blank sheet of printer paper from the drawer and wrote that number by hand using the mechanical pencil I'd carried through 3 decades of construction estimates. $160,000. The ink looked very black against the white. Noreen and I had saved for 40 years. We'd passed on vacations, driven old cars, packed our own lunches, accounted for every dollar. We'd built a modest retirement that would have carried us comfortably into our 90s. 3 years, that's all it took. I sat with that number a long time. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Once, twice, 3 times. I left it alone. I knew it was Dalton probably texting to explain to, smooth it over to reframe it, so the embarrassment in front of the clerk landed on me. I didn't care. Instead, I pulled from my desk drawer a small leather notebook I used to carry for construction estimates back when I had a business and projects to track. The leather had worn soft at the corners. I clicked my pen. I didn't call Dalton. I didn't text Sable to explain myself or make it right. I just wrote. The first line credit cards, the second phone bill, the third insurance. My handwriting stayed steady. My breathing stayed calm. Outside, the January sun was already going down, painting my office walls the color of rust. I kept at it. 3 pages before I stopped. By then the sun had dipped below the neighbor's roofline, and my hand had begun to ache. I closed the notebook, tucked it in my shirt pocket, and stepped outside. The late afternoon light slanted across my front porch, and I settled into the porch swing my wife and I bought 30 years ago, feeling something I hadn't expected: peace. Not anger, not guilt. Just a still clear certainty that I'd done exactly the right thing. My phone had gone quiet 20 minutes before. 7 missed calls from Dalton. 3 texts from Sable, each one a step sharper than the one before. I'd caught the preview of the last one. You embarrassed us in front of... I didn't need the rest. The January air carried that particular Texas coolness that settles in after dark, dry, and easy. Down the block, someone's sprinkler system clicked on with a mechanical hiss. A cardinal called out from the cedar elm that shaded my driveway. I should have felt terrible. I should have been reaching for my phone, drafting some apology, ironing things smooth the way I always had. That's what the old Gerald would have done, the Gerald who'd spent 3 years saying yes to every ask, every forgotten wallet, every crisis that somehow needed my credit card. But I didn't feel terrible. I felt awake. Beautiful evening. Opaline Farnham stood at the edge of my lawn, with a garden hose watering her bed of winter snapdragons that bordered her driveway. My 66-year-old neighbor of 15 years, she knew the name of every plant in her yard and missed nothing from her front window. She paused midstream with the careful hesitation of someone weighing whether to share a troubling thing. "It is," I said. "Saw you heading out this morning with Dalton and Sable," she said, adjusting the spray nozzle. "Furniture shopping, something along those lines. They're doing well, I hope. New house treating them right." "They're managing," I said. Opaline turned the water toward a patch of monkey grass, but her attention stayed on me. She had that quality some people develop with age, the ability to hear what wasn't being said. "Well, Gerald," she said slowly, "I'm not one to gossip. I know that. But there's something I think you ought to know." She shut off the spray and crossed toward me, the hose dragging across the grass behind her. "Last week, Tuesday, I believe I saw Sable here, at your house." "She stops by sometimes," I said. Opaline shook her head. "You weren't home. Your truck was gone. I only caught it because I was hauling in groceries and noticed her car sitting in your driveway." Something tightened in my chest. "She has a key," I said. "I gave them both keys for emergencies." "I know. And I wouldn't think much of it except..." Opaline glanced toward my front window, then back at me. She was inside for nearly an hour, and when she came out, she had a yellow notepad and a tape measure. The cardinal had gone quiet. The sprinkler down the street clicked off. The whole neighborhood suddenly felt very still. "A tape measure," I said again. "I saw her through your living room window before I went in for the groceries. She was measuring the walls. that long wall where the bookshelves sit specifically. Opaline's voice carried the apologetic weight of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have. I went back and forth about saying anything. I didn't want to pry. But after watching you all leave together this morning, and then seeing you come back alone this afternoon, Gerald, I'm not sure I should say this, but it worried me. The porch swing held me still. 15 years. Opaline had lived next door. What else had she noticed and kept to herself? How often had Dalton and Sable come through while my truck sat elsewhere? Rooms I'd framed and finished with my own 2 hands, and someone had been walking them off with a tape measure. I'm glad you said something, Opaline, I told her. She read my face for a beat, and I watched her make a quiet decision to leave a question unasked. I hope this doesn't feel like I'm overstepping, she said. It doesn't. You need me watching things when you're away, you have only to ask. I'll remember that. She gave a nod and eased back toward her side of the property, the hose resuming its arc over Opaline's bed of winter snapdragons that bordered her driveway. Where the spray caught the dying light, little rainbows broke apart above the concrete. I turned back to the house and really took it in, not a glance, a long look. The brick front I'd picked because Noreen loved that particular shade of red. The windows I'd swapped out myself a decade ago, when the original ones started surrendering to drafts. The porch that had held our Sunday morning coffee ritual for 30 years running. The door I'd painted green because she said it reminded her of the hill country. 40 years of my life lived inside those walls. Every beam chosen, every nail driven, every choice made side by side. We'd pulled equity out of it once 20 years back to open up the kitchen. 12 years since the last mortgage payment. What was it pulling on the market now? $400,000, perhaps $450,000 in this zip code. Sable would have the answer. That was her business after all. Sable moving through my rooms with a tape measure and a notepad while I was somewhere else entirely putting figures to my walls. The notebook rode heavier in my breast pocket all of a sudden. I drew it out, found page 4, and pressed a new entry into the paper, keys change locks. Then below that, security camera. Then property deed pull county records. The horizon had swallowed the sun, that short violet dusk. Texas wears so well settled over the street. Lamps stuttered on in both directions. A neighbor's television sent blue light bleeding through their curtains. I stood looking at what I'd built. A house someone was already measuring for the next owner. The gold bled out of the sky, and I watched Opaline move back across her lawn, watched the dark stretch itself, across everything I'd put 30 years into building, and apparently 3 years into defending, without knowing the fight had started. What else had I missed? That night I went to bed and actually slept. Sunday arrived, and the phone on the kitchen counter was lit up and waiting a small, bright alarm I'd earned. 7 missed calls from Dalton, 3 from Sable, 1 text from Dalton that scrolled the full length of the screen. I stood at the counter and read it while the coffee maker hissed and spat behind me. Dad. What happened? The salesperson called us. We had to cancel the whole order. Sable is upset. I don't understand why you did that. We need to talk. Please call me back. The machine finished its cycle. I poured a mug stirred in the cream, the way Noreen always took hers, and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. Outside the window, Opaline's snapdragons were bright in the morning light. The cardinal was back in the cedar elm, cycling through its repertoire. I got halfway through the coffee before I picked up the phone. Dalton answered before the first ring had finished. Dad, thank God, listen about yesterday. Pick up, I said, voice level, the way I'd talk on a job site when a decision had already been made. I didn't have my card with me yesterday. Whatever needs sorting at the store, you and Sable will have to work that out. A long pause opened on the line. Then, but Dad, I ended the call. The phone came alive again before I'd set it flat on the table. I flipped it face down and drank my coffee. Ringing, quiet. Ringing again, quiet. How many years of that same note of crisis in his voice had sent my hand straight to my back pocket? How many times had I heard that particular blend of bewilderment and wounded pride, the setup that reliably ended with me saying yes? I put the mug in the sink and looked at the clock. 9:15 Sunday morning. The rest of the day was open, and it was mine. Then another buzz. Not Dalton this time. The screen showed Clifton Haywood. I answered. Gerald, my cousin, said, and I heard the measured tone he kept for situations where someone's ledger didn't balance. Got a few minutes? Let me buy you some coffee. We went to the spot we'd been using for Sunday mornings, off and on, across 15 years, 3 blocks from my house, a little shop with bad coffee and back booths where a conversation could stay private. Clifton Haywood, 36 years old, had parlayed a gift for numbers into a solid accounting practice, and he set his cup on the table with the deliberate economy of a man paid to find what doesn't add up. But word got around about yesterday, he said. I held off. The furniture store. Dalton phoned him that morning, worked up about it. Clifton circled his cup with both palms. He was hoping I'd talk some sense into you, tell you it was all a big mix-up. I told him I'd reach out and I meant it, but not with the message he had in mind. He settled back against the booth, watching me with the same patient focus he'd give a set of accounts where something was off. Gerald, I realize this isn't what you want, sitting across from your morning coffee, but numbers are what I do, and I've had a look at Dalton's numbers. My cup hadn't moved. How much have you seen? I asked. Not the full picture, not my client uses a cheaper shop across town. But this profession has a small world. People talk at conferences. Last year at the CPA conference, his accountant came up in conversation, griping mostly, said Dalton was leveraged to the point where it was becoming a concern. Leveraged, I said back to him. Every card at its ceiling, vehicle loans on cars worth less than the balance owed, a mortgage that would look aggressive on someone pulling double what he actually reports. Clifton's voice went a register lower. Gerald, your son is operating right at the edge. He's been there a good while, and my guess is you're the reason he hasn't gone over. The spreadsheet came to mind, that final cell, 3 years of charges stacked into a sum that would take most working people 5 years to earn. Can you dig into it? I asked. I need the real picture, not just the outline. Clifton sat with that a moment. On the other side of the coffee shop window, a young family moved down the sidewalk, dad with a toddler riding his shoulders, mother steering a stroller, all three of them loose and laughing. Effortless, unclouded. That gets complicated, Clifton said, from where I sit professionally. I'm not asking you to cross any line. What I'm asking for is what's already out there to be seen. Public filings, credit reports where you can pull them. What a careful accountant notices when a family member's situation worries him. He's your boy, Clifton said softer now. You could put the question to him directly. I could, I said. And he'd shape the answer to whatever kept the money moving. He'd hand me just enough truth to make me feel guilty enough to open the checkbook again. That's the road that brought us here. Clifton dipped his head. He got it. He'd watched this particular pattern play out before families draining themselves dry for the sake of someone the money could never actually fix. I'll see what the picture looks like, he said. A few days may be stretching to a week. I won't make noise about it. I appreciate it. We finished another 20 minutes on easier ground. Clifton's wife was carrying their second. The practice had a good wind behind it. He was weighing whether to bring on a junior accountant for the overflow. Ordinary life, pleasant conversation, but something was rearranging itself beneath all of it, quiet and purposeful. 35 years I'd raised structures meant to outlast the people who hired me homes, that wouldn't buckle in a storm, footings that held through bad soil framing, that kept its shape when the weather turned ugly. The time had come to build something different, something with the specific purpose of protecting what remained. As we got up to go, Clifton gripped my shoulder. Gerald, he said, whatever it is you're setting in motion, move carefully. When family and money tangle together, there's no messier knot. I know it, I said, but I kept to myself, the notebook in my shirt pocket, the list still growing inside it, and the tape measure Opaline had watched in Sable's hands. The drive home left me with a feeling I hadn't anticipated. Not the raw heat of anger, not the gnaw of guilt Dalton's voice had been working to plant. Something closer to the clear-headed focus that used to come over me the morning before, a big pour, everything assessed, everything laid out ready to begin. Home again, I drew out the green composition notebook I'd used for 30 years. Of project estimates, clicked the pen 3 times, and put one word at the top of a clean page, reclamation. Underneath it, transferred from the leather notebook in clean block print. Credit cards remove authorized user. Cell phones transfer billing responsibility. Auto insurance remove vehicle from policy. Garage clear their belongings. Keys retrieve house access. I set the notebook beside the keyboard, opened the laptop, and worked from the top down. The credit card company picked up on the 4th ring. A pleasant recorded voice presented me with a list of options. I kept pressing 0 until a real person came on the line. When she asked what she could help me with, I told her straight I needed to remove an authorized user from my account. Effective right now. 5 minutes was all it required. Name, account number, a confirmation code texted to my phone. Finished. Dalton's Platinum Rewards card with its $20,000 ceiling would be dead by midnight. I put a single line through that entry on the page. On to the next call. I'd like to transfer billing responsibility for 2 lines, I told the cellular provider. The rep pushed a family plan upgrade on me. I declined 3 times before she finally ran the request through. In 12 days at the close of the current billing cycle, those 2 numbers would need their own account, or they'd go silent. Another line drawn. Auto insurance took more doing. The agent wanted to understand why I was pulling a vehicle off my multi-car policy. I told him my son had arranged his own coverage. He came back with a discount I'd be giving up, asked whether I'd thought it through. I had. By the time the call ended, I'd freed up another $97 every month. I scratched through the math on a corner of paper. Cell phones, $160. Auto insurance, $97. Credit card, average monthly charges, $540. Monthly savings, total, $797, rounded to $800. The desk clock showed 4:12 p.m. In under 3 hours, I'd gotten nearly $10,000 a year back. 3 more items got their lines. I pushed back from the desk and stood. My back had stiffened. My writing hand had cramped up. But what I was feeling in my chest had nothing to do with either of those things. It was the feeling of a job moving forward. I hit the button for the garage, and the door groaned up. The fluorescent tubes overhead stuttered to life, throwing that flat industrial light that finds every cobweb, every mote of dust, everything that has no business being there. And there was plenty that had no business being there. Dalton's patio set, the one they'd bought 2 summers back and swapped out last year, stood stacked against the far wall. Sable's exercise bike occupied a corner, tags still dangling, gathering a fine coat of dust. Beneath my workbench, a row of boxes wore labels like old clothes and college stuff and pre-marriage, as though they'd been fixtures since the beginning of time. When exactly had all this crept in? When had my garage become their off-site storage unit? I went to the toolbox and pulled out a thick black marker. I walked to the patio table and printed across the top in capitals Dalton, the chairs Dalton, the exercise bike Sable. Every box, every piece of cast-off furniture, every item taking up square footage in a space I'd paid for and maintained and apparently donated as a free warehouse. I put a name on all of it. Then I hauled flattened cardboard in from the recycling and got to work. Smaller pieces first. The same sequence I'd walked Dalton through on a job site the summer he was 16 working for my company. Everything labeled, everything accounted for, everything in its place. By 9 that night, I had 6 boxes sealed and queued by the garage door. The patio set stayed put, too bulky to box, but it wore their names in black ink. I stood in the cleared space and breathed. Actually breathed. I hadn't felt that kind of room in years. Monday morning, Dalton's truck rolled into the driveway at 7:45. I watched from the kitchen window as he stepped out, straightened his tie, and came toward the front door with the walk of someone who'd rehearsed what he was going to say. He still had a key. I listened to it, find the lock, listened to the bolt turn, listened to the door swing inward. I was 3 feet inside, hand already out. "Dalton," I said, "I need your key." He pulled up mid-stride, hand still resting on the knob, whatever speech he'd prepared dissolving before it reached his mouth. "What?" "Your house key. I'd like it back." He looked at my open palm, the way someone looks at an accusation, like the request itself was the unreasonable thing. "Dad, I've had a key to this house since I lived here. And living here is behind you now," I said. Morning sun came through the doorway at his back and cut half his face into shadow. I could see the calculations running, probing for the angle, the framing that might let him walk away with what he'd always taken for granted. "What if something happens?" He tried. "You call or you knock. This is ridiculous. I'm your son." "I haven't forgotten that," I said. My hand stayed level. "At the key, Dalton." A full minute might have passed. 2 men in a doorway, father and son, growing more like strangers by the second. At last, Dalton reached into his pocket and worked the key ring out. His fingers picked at the small brass key, the one I'd pressed into his hand when he turned 18, the one I'd given him, with the words that this house would always be his home, that the door would always be open. It felt oddly heavy landing in my palm. 39 years of fatherhood, and it had come down to 3 ounces of brass. "Anything else?" Dalton asked, voice pulled tight. "There are boxes in the garage with your things. Pick them up whenever works for you." He held my gaze a moment. I held his. Then he walked to his truck and didn't look back. The engine turned. He reversed out. The sound of it faded down the block. I stood in the entryway long after his truck was gone, the brass key sitting in my palm. One key recovered. But if they'd grown comfortable enough to walk in it, will stack their overflow in my garage, possibly use my address for purposes I hadn't approved, this was only the first step. I made the call that same Monday. By Monday afternoon, a locksmith named Amos Kincaid was at work on my heavy oak front door, and I watched him the same way I used to watch a crew during a foundation inspection, because that's exactly what this was, a different kind of foundation. Amos Kincaid, 52 years old, his van lettered with San Antonio's most trusted security in faded blue, worked with the unhurried patience of a man who'd hung 10,000 locks and still treated each one like it deserved his full attention. "Smart lock," he said, holding up a sleek black panel that looked nothing like the brass deadbolt it was replacing. "Fingerprint or phone code, no physical key option at all." "Good," I said. He glanced over, seemed to be weighing a question, then turned back to his work. The drill bit into the door. Fine wood dust drifted down across my welcome mat. 3 hours later, every way into my house had been remade. Front door, garage entry, the side door that opens onto the backyard. Each one now carried a black touchscreen panel that pulsed soft blue when you came near. Amos walked me through the whole system, his calloused fingers moving across the screens, showing me how to enroll my thumbprint, how to pull up the app on my phone, how to issue a temporary access code when a contractor needed to get inside. "Without your fingerprint or phone code, nobody's walking through," he said. "Not with any key and not with a locksmith's tools either." That's precisely what I was after. He set up the camera system next. Wide-angle lens mounted above the front door, a smaller unit covering the driveway, a video doorbell sharp enough to read a license plate, all of it feeding into the same app. "You'll get a notification every time someone comes up to the door," Amos said. "Motion activated, saves to cloud storage, 14-day archive." I watched him fix the last camera to the eave above the spot where I'd replaced rotted fascia 2 summers back. "Can I access older footage?" I asked. "From before you installed?" "No, sir. Recording starts from today forward. Nothing from before is there to retrieve." I took that in. It settled one open question. Whatever Sable had been measuring, whatever other visits had taken place while I was elsewhere, that was gone. But from here on, I'd see everything. Amos loaded his tools, handed me an invoice I settled in cash, and pulled out in his lettered van. The new locks clicked into place with clean digital finality when I ran the test. Cool, crisp, done. 30 years I'd anchored foundations with concrete and rebar. Now I was doing it with code and a fingerprint. I settled into my living room chair and opened the camera app for the first time. 3 feeds loaded on my phone screen front door, showing Opaline's house across the street, driveway showing my truck, side yard showing the gate to the backyard. Every angle covered, every entrance under watch. My house, my terms. Tuesday morning, I drove to the post office and took out a P.O. box. Small bottom row deposit paid for a full year. I filled out change of address cards for everything that mattered: bank statements, insurance, documents, medical records, tax correspondence. Anything sensitive would now go to box 247 instead of 31124 Ridgecrest Drive. Anything Dalton or Sable might go looking for would find only circulars and grocery store flyers. Back home, I worked through the stack of mail I'd let accumulate over the past week. Credit card solicitations, utility bills, a notice about a property tax assessment. Nothing worth a second look until near the bottom of the pile. A plain white envelope. Return address from a bank I'd never dealt with. But the name in the recipient line stopped me cold. Dalton Prescott, it read. And beneath that, 3124 Ridgecrest Drive, San Antonio, Texas. My address, my son's name. A bank I'd never once heard him mention. I opened it. Credit card statement. Current balance 8417. Minimum payment past due. Late fee assessed. Interest accruing at 29.9%. I scanned the charges: restaurants, a gas station online, purchases another restaurant. Nothing remarkable on its face. Just a man outspending his income on borrowed credit. But then I found it. The registration address printed at the bottom of the statement. Account opened March 2021. Registration address 3124 Ridgecrest Drive. My address, my house. I set the statement down the way you'd set down something that might break if your hand shook. Then I walked to my home office and opened the credit monitoring service I paid $14 a month for and rarely thought about. I logged in, worked through to the detailed report, scrolled past my mortgage, my 2 credit cards. The small car loan from 3 years ago, I'd cleared ahead of schedule. Then I reached the section marked Associated Addresses. My address came up 3 times. Once under my name, that was expected. Twice under Dalton's. Different creditors, different account numbers. My hands held steady as I clicked further in. The first account, a balance of $8,000. I already knew that one, the statement was on my kitchen table. The second, $12,000. $20,000 in credit card debt registered to my home address. $20,000 in potential exposure if something went sideways, if creditors came looking, if collectors decided that address made me the responsible party. How many pieces of mail had I passed to Dalton without a second thought over the years? How many times had he mentioned he was expecting something, asked me to watch for a particular envelope I'd been deliberate about, the garage about the keys, about the locks? But this angle had never occurred to me. I sat at my kitchen table a long while staring at that envelope. 3 smart locks, 2 cameras of video. Doorbell I'd secured every physical entrance. But here in black and white was a door I never knew existed. A back channel Dalton had opened using my address, my home, my identity. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a name I'd saved 3 years back and never dialed. Reginald Thorne, attorney at law. It was time to make that call. I reached him that same afternoon. He had time the following morning. Reginald Thorne's office held the particular smell of old law books and furniture polish, the smell of a place where serious things got handled. I sat across from him in a leather chair and laid out what I'd uncovered. My son had been registering credit cards to my home address without my knowledge. Reginald Thorne, the 58-year-old estate attorney, set his pen down and fixed me with the measured gravity of a surgeon, describing an operation that couldn't wait. I had brought the credit card statement, the spreadsheet covering 3 years of payments, the credit monitoring report with the 2 addresses attached to my name. I arranged them on his desk the way you'd present evidence. Reginald worked through each document in silence, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I'd finished explaining the furniture store, the tape measure, the garage stacked with their belongings, he set the pen down and looked at me directly. "Gerald," he said, "your current will leaves you exposed. Any health event, even a temporary one, allows whoever holds your power of attorney to execute documents on your behalf. And Dalton has held your POA since 2018. The room seemed to drop in temperature. "What?" Reginald pulled a file from the cabinet. "My name on the tab." He opened it, turned it so I could read it. My signature, Dalton's name, power of attorney, dated November 2018. The year Noreen died. The year I would have signed anything someone placed in front of me. I had. "I signed that the year Noreen passed," I said, hearing the words as though someone else was saying them. I wasn't thinking straight. "I understand," Reginald said. "Under ordinary circumstances, a POA makes sense, an adult child helping an aging parent keep things in order. But given everything you've described, the financial pattern, your address on his credit accounts, the tape measure, this represents serious vulnerability." He drew out a clean sheet of paper and sketched a simple diagram. My house at the top, lines running to Dalton, to creditors, to the POA. 3 things need to happen, Reginald said. Revoke the existing POA before a notary today if possible. Establish a revocable living trust that shields your assets, and update your will with language specific enough to hold. Texas homestead law protects your property from Dalton's creditors, but it won't protect you from Dalton himself if you lose capacity. A living trust will. "How long will all that take?" I asked. "The POA revocation can be notarized this afternoon. I have a notary on staff. The trust and will revision will run a week, maybe 2. I'll need full financial documentation. Bank accounts, investment accounts, the property deed." I thought about the spreadsheet, the camera system, the smart locks, all the defenses I'd assembled across the past 10 days. And beneath all of it, this gap, a legal vulnerability I'd signed into existence during the worst year of my life. "Yes," I said, to all of it. Reginald kept writing. We went another 40 minutes asset protection estate, planning the precise language required to prevent Dalton from mounting a challenge later. When I walked out of his office 2 hours later, the POA was revoked, notarized, and filed. The rest would follow. The drive home left me feeling the way I'd feel after reinforcing a foundation I hadn't known was giving way. Wednesday morning, I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when the phone rang. Dalton's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Dad. His voice sat somewhere between panic and anger. My phone just dropped off your plan. I got an email from the insurance carrier, too. What's going on? I took a slow sip before I answered. Let him sit in the pause. Well, it wasn't cut, I said, my voice level. It was transferred to your name. The bill comes to you directly now. Same with the insurance, your vehicle, your responsibility. I can't afford. You can't just, Dad. We need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, I said. You're 39 years old. You have a job. These are your expenses. But you've always... I know what I've always done, I said. I'm putting responsibility back where it belongs. Quiet on the line. I could hear him breathing. I could picture him in his car or maybe at his desk phone against his ear searching for the argument that would move me. For 3 years, I'd been the scaffolding underneath their whole structure. Now they were finding out what happens when the scaffolding comes down. This isn't fair, Dalton said after a stretch. No, I agreed. It isn't. I hung up before he could get another word in. The kitchen sat very still. The refrigerator ran its low hum. A car went by outside. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning, but the ground had shifted. I set the phone face down and refilled my coffee. The clock above the stove read 8:43. I'd ended that call at 8:35. 8 minutes of quiet, 9, 10. I drank and watched the clock and wondered if that would be the end of it. Wondered whether Dalton would call back or show up at the door, only to find locks that wouldn't respond to any key he carried and cameras marking his arrival. Exactly 10 minutes. Then the screen lit up and buzzed against the table. Sable's name. I picked up on the third ring. Her voice arrived smooth and paced as though she'd spent those 10 minutes scripting every word. Gerald. Not Dad, never Dad. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Dalton simply forgot his wallet that day. You don't need to punish us like this. Punish. I turned the word over. Sable. I said, holding the same calm register she'd come in with. There is no misunderstanding. This is my decision. But cutting off his phone, his insurance, that's extreme. We're family. Nothing was cut. Everything was transferred to his name. He's an adult with income. These are his responsibilities. I heard her breath catch just barely. The script wasn't landing. I could almost feel her recalculating. Gerald, you're being unreasonable. We've always been able to count on you. You're not acting like yourself. There it was. The suggestion that something had gone wrong with me. That my clarity was a symptom. That my decisions were confusion wearing a calm face. I'm acting exactly like myself, I said, possibly for the first time in 3 years. Another pause longer. When she spoke again, the measured sweetness was gone entirely. You're affecting our family. Her voice had sharpened controlled anger where controlled kindness had been. You're hurting us. I'm stopping myself from subsidizing your family, I said. That's a different thing. How many times had she run this same play, converted my love for my son into a lever, used the word family like a passkey to my wallet, my garage, my home, my identity. Dalton is devastated, she tried. Dalton is capable, I said. Silence. Not the silence of someone reaching for words, the silence of someone arriving at a decision. Then the call ended. No goodbye, no parting anger, just the clean sound of disconnection. She'd hung up first, not out of emotion, because the conversation had stopped yielding results, because the usual instruments weren't working, because she needed to step back and come at this from a different angle. I set my phone on the table and held it in my gaze for a long beat. Noreen would have had Sable's number inside half a minute. She had that gift seeing past what a person said to what they actually meant, past what they showed to what they were really after. I missed her with an ache that lived in my chest, one that 3 years hadn't done a thing to soften. The rest of Wednesday moved along in quiet routine. I ate lunch, read the paper, checked the camera feeds on my phone. Nothing but Opaline tending her winter snapdragons and a delivery truck rolling past. Ordinary life, pressing on while everything below the surface was shifting. That night, though, I lay in the dark with only the small bedside lamp burning, and sleep kept its distance. My mind kept going back to Dalton at 8 years old, trailing after me to job sites on Saturdays, in that child-sized hard hat I'd picked out for him, his eyes wide and full of light as he watched walls climb up from bare foundations. His small hand tucked into mine, his unshakable belief that his father could raise anything from the ground. When I grow up, I'm gonna build houses just like you, Dad. He'd said exactly that. I remembered it without any effort, the pride woven through his voice. the uncomplicated faith that we'd always be working toward the same things together. When had any of that changed? When had he traded the urge to build for the urge to take? I reached over to the nightstand for my phone. The screen threw a pale glow into the dark. I scrolled to Dalton's name in my contacts. My thumb hung over the call button. One call that was all it would take. I could smooth the whole thing over, tell him I'd overreacted, switch the phone back on, put him back on the insurance, hand him a check to cover the trouble. But that 8-year-old in the hard hat was long gone. The man he'd grown into needed to learn something I couldn't teach him by shielding him from his own choices. My thumb started moving toward the button. Then my eyes went to Noreen's photograph sitting beside the lamp. The one from our 40th anniversary 2 years before she fell ill. That quiet smile, those knowing eyes, the way she'd look at me whenever I was on the verge of getting it wrong, patient trusting me to find my way on my own. She used to say something when Dalton was young and had gotten himself into trouble, and I was ready to step in and fix it for him. Loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from every consequence, Gerald. It means helping them become a better person. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let them fall. I'd push back on that. Said it was cold. Said a father's whole purpose was to catch his son. No, she'd said, her paint-stained fingers resting against my face. She'd been at her watercolors that afternoon. A father's job is to teach his son to stand back up. I set the phone down carefully, face against the nightstand, the screen going dark. Noreen was right, as she'd been about most things. Dalton needed to fall, and I needed to let it happen. Not for want of love, because of it. I switched off the lamp and lay there in the stillness, listening to the house breathe around me. The groan of old timber, the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the faint sound of a car moving along the street outside. This house had stood 40 years because the foundation underneath it was sound, because I'd built it to hold through whatever came, because I'd understood when to use steel and when to allow for give. Dalton needed a foundation of his own, but it wasn't mine to pour for him. He'd have to mix and lay it himself. I closed my eyes. I woke Thursday morning carrying the kind of stillness that only follows a long night spent wrestling in the dark. Noreen had been right, as she'd been about most things. The seed was already in the ground. Now it had to find its own way up, without me feeding it water, without me keeping the weather off it. All I could do was trust what had been set in motion. What that process demanded, I discovered, was a patience I wasn't sure I still had in me. Thursday morning, a friend forwarded me a Facebook post with the note, "Thought you should see this." I clicked the link, and there was Sable's carefully arranged public grief laid out for anyone to read. The post was a small masterpiece of studied vagueness. No names, no hard details. Just enough of a shape to make people fill in the picture while leaving her hands clean. When family members you've always supported suddenly become distant and selfish, it breaks your heart. Some people forget where they came from and who helped them get there, praying for guidance during this difficult time. 3 sad face emojis. A praying hands emoji, 47 likes already, and a string of sympathetic comments from her circle. Stay strong, you deserve better. Family can be so toxic. I read it through once, turned my phone face down on the kitchen table, poured another cup of coffee, spread the newspaper to the crossword. I didn't reply, didn't volunteer my side, didn't explain or push back or try to correct the version of events she was assembling for her audience. The silence was its own kind of answer. But before I'd gotten through my coffee, I drifted back to the post. I scrolled through the sympathetic chorus one more time, reading the comments piling up around Sable's unnamed wounds. And then I saw it, near the bottom of the thread. A comment from someone named Nadell Corwin, whose profile photo showed a woman around Sable's age holding a toddler. "I'm sorry you're going through this, but I have to ask, why can't you and Dalton support yourselves? You both have jobs, right? No sad face, no performance of sympathy. Just a plain question left sitting there. The thread beneath it was quiet. No reply from Sable. No attempt to explain it away. Just the question hanging in the open for whoever scrolled past to see. Sable's bid for public sympathy had accidentally called up the one question that cut straight through her victim narrative. And my silence, my complete absence from the whole exchange made that question ring even louder. I put the phone down and smiled into my coffee. Sometimes the truest response is no response at all. Friday morning, I sent Dalton a text, plain and short. "You have belongings in the garage. Pick them up before the weekend." He pulled into the driveway 2 hours later in his truck alone. I watched on the camera feed as he sat behind the wheel for a full minute before climbing out. His face was flushed, his expression locked down tight. I triggered the garage door from my phone before he reached it. The 6 cardboard boxes stood in a line against the wall where I'd staged them. Each one marked in black marker Dalton Sable, sealed with packing tape, organized, finished. Dalton stopped in the doorway and stared at them. "Seriously, Dad," he said. "You're kicking my stuff out. The garage is mine." I kept my voice level. "Your things are being returned to you." He looked at me the way you look at someone you no longer recognize. Maybe he was right to. Maybe the father who'd always said yes, who'd opened his wallet and his home and his garage without a second thought, maybe that version of me was a stranger to him now. "This is insane," he said. But he reached down and lifted the first box. I'd spent 30 years raising structures built to hold through storms. It never occurred to me that I'd failed to teach my son how to build shelter of his own. Dalton made 4 trips to the truck, each box dropped into the bed with more force than it needed. The crack of cardboard against metal carrying clean through the quiet morning. Doing it with his hands made it real, in a way that no phone call or message could have. I stayed in the garage and watched. Didn't step in, didn't explain, just bore witness. The patio furniture went last. He had to shift the boxes around to fit the chairs and table, run bungee cords across everything, work out how to tie the load down. Things he would have called on me for, before things I'd have handled without waiting to be asked. When the last piece was secured, Dalton stood at the tailgate with both hands resting on it, his shoulders rising and falling, with heavy breaths, not from the effort, from something else entirely. He turned to look at me. "You're making me look like the bad guy," he said. Every box he'd loaded into that truck carried 39 years of fatherhood. The weight of it showed in how he held himself. "No," I said, holding his eyes. "I'm stopping covering up the consequences for you." The words settled between us in the cold air of the garage. The concrete floor swept bare. The empty stretch of wall where his things had been. The gap between father and son measured out in feet and years and decisions that neither of us could walk back. Dalton's jaw went tight. His hands closed into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might say something, might ask what had really broken, might reach for some kind of understanding, might even find his way to an apology. Instead, he got into his truck, turned the engine over, and reversed out of my driveway without a word. I stood there watching his taillights curve out of sight around the corner. The garage felt bigger without their things filling it. Emptier. What I was about to find out wasn't something I could have prepared for. The kind of thing that changes how you see everyone you thought you knew. Before we get there, if someone you loved had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the evidence build first? That oil stain on the concrete, I knew exactly which truck had left. In my first work truck, the one that started everything. The wall hooks where Noreen kept her garden tools. Every corner of that garage was mine by right and by history. I hit the button and listened to the door grind shut. Long after Dalton's truck rounded the corner and vanished, I was still standing in the driveway. Behind me, the floor was bare concrete swept clean. Nothing left of theirs. Key back in my possession. New locks on every entry. But somewhere in my gut, I understood that the real difficulty was still coming. They weren't the type to accept a closed door. They'd come back with something thought through. That something materialized at the very next Saturday. I was out back working the rose bushes Noreen had put in years ago when my phone went off a camera alert. 2 people on the front porch, arms full of what looked like party supplies. I pulled up the feed. Dalton and Sable. She'd made an effort with her appearance, dressed up hair, fixed a large shopping bag hanging from one arm, packed with what I could see were decorative items. Dalton stood next to her, his eyes fixed on the smart lock panel hand, drifting toward the screen with the baffled expression of a man expecting a keyhole that no longer existed. The image was sharp. The sound when Dalton finally pushed the doorbell came through clean on both my phone and inside the house at once. I hit the microphone. "Hey, Dad!" Dalton said, his voice pitched in that pleasant register he used when he needed something from someone who wasn't cooperating. "Open the door. We've got people coming. We're throwing a housewarming today and we need the backyard." Need. Not asking, not requesting. Need. I stayed where I was, shears in one hand, phone in the other. "Dalton," I said even and quiet through the speaker. "Nobody invited me to host a party at this address." Sable moved in front of the camera, that smile tight and calculated. "We sent you a text last week. Maybe you missed it." There was no text. She knew it. I knew it. Our yard's just too small. Dalton started to explain. That's what happens when you choose a house with a small yard, I told him. This isn't a good day for this. I'm sorry. I cut the microphone. On the screen, I watched them stand there, Dalton pressing the doorbell a second time. Sable's mouth moving words I couldn't make out with the audio off. Then her phone-out thumbs going hard across the screen. My phone lit up. Sable calling. I dismissed it. They stayed on that porch for 3 more minutes. Dalton put his hand on the door handle and tested it. Nothing moved. Sable tried twice more to reach me. Neither call went through to me. In the end, they picked up the unopened bag and walked back to their car. Just like that, they were gone. I'd put up solid walls. What I was witnessing now was the two of them working along the perimeter, pressing for give. There wasn't any, not this time. I went back to the Roses. Monday morning, I walked into our usual coffee shop and found Clifton already in the rear booth, the one we always claimed. A manila folder sat in front of him, thin but deliberate. His face told me before the folder did. "You asked me to look into it," he said as I took my seat. No greeting, no preamble. So I did. He slid the folder across. Inside the first page was a typed summary, the sort of clean, organized document Clifton prepared when a client needed the full weight of their situation laid out without softening. Dalton Prescott credit card debt analysis, 5 accounts, 5 outstanding balances, interest rates running from 22 to 29% across the board. Card 1, 18,600. Card 2, 21,200. Card 3, 14,800. Card 4, 16,900. Card 5, 15,900. Total, 87,400. I went over that figure 3 times, let it settle. Then I set it down and glanced out the window, a father passing by outside with a toddler in a stroller, laughing about something easy and uncomplicated. Nothing about what I was reading was uncomplicated. "That's just the credit cards," Clifton said quietly. "The mortgage is on page 2. I turned it over. Purchase price $395,000. Down payment $25,000 my money, the loan that was never meant to be permanent. Remaining balance $370,000. Monthly payment $3,200. What's he bringing in? I asked. $72,000 a year before taxes, Clifton said. Sales manager. I cross-checked it against LinkedIn and a couple of contacts in the industry. After you pull out taxes and insurance, he's clearing maybe $4,000 a month, and that's being generous. The arithmetic wasn't hard, but it was ugly. So the mortgage by itself is eating 80% of what he takes home, I said. More than that, once you count property tax and homeowner's insurance. And none of that touches the card minimums, the car note, power, groceries, fuel. Clifton settled back against the booth. Gerald, by any honest measure, he's been drowning for a long time. The only reason he hasn't gone under is you. My coffee had gone cold without my touching it. What about Sable? Commission-only real estate. MLS data puts her gross last year somewhere around $30,000. That's not enough to move the needle on any of this. I kept my eyes on the page, the column of minimum payments, the month-by-month picture Clifton had assembled, showing what came in against what went out. The whole thing was a structure collapsing in slow motion, and I'd been the temporary shoring that held it upright. Give me a timeline on the mortgage, I said. Clifton consulted the third page, worked through it in his head, then looked at me directly. 3 months, he said. Maybe less. He's almost certainly already picking which cards get paid and which ones slide into delinquency. Up to now, the mortgage stayed current because you were absorbing the rest. Without that cushion, he let it hang. I sat there in that booth across from Clifton, with the numbers spread in front of me, the card balances, the mortgage that consumed the lion's share of Dalton's take-home, an equation that simply wouldn't balance. 3 months. Maybe less. It wasn't a slow leak anymore. It was a fuse, and the people holding it were about to get frightened. Frightened people move fast, and they don't always move smart. The first move, though, didn't come from them. It came from the truth finding its own way to me. Tuesday afternoon, I was at the mailbox when Opaline appeared at the fence, her garden hose going over the snapdragons, wearing the particular expression of someone deciding whether a thing is their business to say. "Gerald," she said, shutting off the nozzle. "I saw what happened Saturday. That porch camera of yours must have had an interesting morning." "It did," I said. She looked down at the flowers, then back up. "I don't know if I should get into this." The phrasing was almost identical to what she'd said when she'd first mentioned the measuring tape incident. But there's something from a few weeks back. I heard Sable out on your porch on her phone. What she said was, eventually that house will be ours anyway, just have to wait. The mailbox key was still pinched between my fingers. I held very still. When exactly? I asked. Early January, well before any of the lock business. I was hauling in groceries and there she was right on your front steps. Phone up studying your door the way you look at something that already belongs to you. I said the phrase back slowly. Eventually that house will be ours. Her exact words. I've thought about them more than once since then. Will be. Not might be. Like it wasn't even a question. I stayed with Opaline's face for a moment. A woman who kept to herself, who tended her own yard, who didn't speak up unless the thing genuinely needed saying. I appreciate you telling me, I said. I worried about overstepping. You didn't. She gave a small nod, opened the nozzle again, and turned back to her garden. I went inside and stopped in the middle of my living room. 30 years ago, I had framed these walls myself, run the insulation, hung the drywall, rolled on every coat of paint, laid every plank of that floor. This house was mine in the deepest way a thing can belong to a person built by hand year by year. And someone had been standing on my porch alive and well, and listening through the phone, telling someone else it was only a matter of waiting me out. Not a son who might someday carry the place forward with respect. Someone sizing up a carcass. The measuring tape visit made a different kind of sense now. That wasn't decorating curiosity. It was reconnaissance, room dimensions, layout, the shape of what they intended to claim. I settled onto the couch, the one Noreen and I had picked up at an estate sale in 1996, and faced the cold fireplace. Eventually that house will be ours anyway. Just have to wait. Wednesday morning, I was at my desk in the home office with a cardboard box of old mail I'd been putting off shredding. Bill's old statements, circulars for people who'd sold the place before me. But Opaline's words had changed how I was looking at things, so I went through it carefully. The first envelope on the stack was Dalton's credit card statement, the one already in Reginald's hands. Under it, though, was another. Different institution, different account number, same name, same address. 3124 Ridgecrest Drive, Dalton Prescott. Balance $21,200. I kept going. Another envelope, a third bank, another card. Dalton Prescott, 3124 Ridgecrest Drive. Balance $14,800. My hands picked up speed as the picture clarified, sorting through a season's worth of accumulated paper. Fourth envelope, a different name, Sable Prescott. 3124 Ridgecrest Drive. Balance $16,900. Fifth envelope, Sable Prescott, same address. Balance $15,900. 5 envelopes, 5 separate credit card accounts, every single one registered to my address. I went over that figure 3 times. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Reginald Thorne. He picked up on the second ring. "Yes, this is Reginald," he said. I kept my voice steady. "They've been using my address. Not one card, 5. 3 under Dalton's name, 2 under Sable's." The pause on his end wasn't confusion. It was a lawyer's mind turning over the legal weight of what I'd just told him. "Gerald," he said, choosing his words with care, "scan every one of those envelopes and get them to me. All of them. And don't reach out to Dalton or Sable about any of this before we sit down." "Why not?" "Because what you're describing could constitute identity fraud. Using another person's address to open credit accounts without their knowledge or permission, that's not just a bad decision. Under Texas law, depending on how it was done, it can be a criminal matter." The room felt colder. "Criminal," I said. "I need to look at the actual documents before I can tell you where this lands. But, Gerald, if they've been routing credit accounts through your home address, if mail was coming here without your authorization, if any of it was done to manufacture a financial profile, they couldn't otherwise claim yes, that moves out of civil and into criminal territory." I looked at the 5 envelopes laid out across my desk. "Get me those scans today," Reginald said. "I'll go through them tonight. We meet tomorrow." "I'll be there." I put the phone down and sat with the evidence in front of me. Clifton's folder had already shown me the $87,400, but I had read that as Dalton's failure, a son who spent beyond his reach with a father too willing to cushion the fall. Now, the picture was different. The debt hadn't been billed to Dalton and Sable at their home. It had been billed in their names at mine. My address, my home, my standing. They hadn't simply taken advantage of my generosity. They'd folded my existence into the architecture of their debt, used my house as the foundation their credit was built on. I sat there with those 5 envelopes fanned across the desk, like items entered into evidence. This wasn't a son struggling with money. This was deliberate appropriation, and I needed Reginald Thorne to tell me precisely what I was holding. Thursday afternoon, I sat across from Reginald as he worked through the scanned envelopes on his screen, his face settling into a grimmer cast with each one. When he finally set his pen down, the silence in that oak-paneled office carried real weight. Routing credit accounts through someone else's address without authorization that qualifies as identity fraud under Texas law. He said, "Gerald, this is serious." He had arranged all 5 chronologically across his desk, a paper timeline of what had been done and when. "The trust documents are ready," he said. "My team worked through last night after your scans came in." He touched the earliest envelope. "But before you put pen to anything, you need to understand what these represent legally." He slid a single-typed page across the desk, clean spare, the kind of document a lawyer produces when the news has weight. Establishing credit using another person's residential address without written authorization from the property owner can constitute identity fraud under Texas Penal Code, Section 32.51. The fact that Dalton is your son doesn't create an exception. The statute doesn't recognize that distinction. Then he pushed 3 documents toward me: trust agreement, updated will, beneficiary designations. Sign these today. The trust is active the moment it's filed. Your house, your accounts, your vehicles, all of it transfers into the trust. You remain the sole trustee. Nothing changes in how you use or control any of it. But legally, none of those assets can be reached by outside creditors or by anyone who might claim authority over your affairs. "And the envelopes?" I asked. "They go into a separate file," Reginald said. "Evidence. We don't move on them yet, but they're documented. And in a way they don't realize, so are they?" I picked up the pen and signed all 3. Friday evening, I was in the living room with a book when the camera alert buzzed. One figure on the porch, alone. Dalton, no folder, no bag, no Sable beside him. He stood under the porch light with his hands tucked in his jacket pockets, staring at the smart lock panel with an expression that still hadn't fully accepted its existence. He didn't press the bell right away, just stood there. I watched for 30 seconds before I opened the microphone. "Dalton," I said. He flinched a little, looked up toward the camera. "Dad," he said. I wanted to talk." My finger hovered near the unlock button. Every exchange over the past 2 months had carried an angle behind it. Every visit had a purpose, but he was alone, and the weariness on his face wasn't the weariness of someone running a calculation. It was something older and heavier than that. I unlocked the door. He came in and sat on the couch, the 1996 estate sale couch, without asking, without any preamble, just lowered himself onto it the way a person does when they've been carrying something they're no longer sure they can hold. "Where's Sable?" I asked. "Home," he said. "She doesn't know I came." We sat without talking. I didn't offer anything, didn't fill the air. I waited. "Are you trying to teach me something?" he said at last. The question landed differently than I expected. Not because I lacked an answer, but because he was the one asking it. "I'm trying not to stand between you and learning it yourself," I said. Somewhere beneath the debt and the poor choices and Sable's ambitions, that 8-year-old who used to trail behind me at job sites was still present. Dalton looked down at his hands, at the room where he'd grown up, at the man he'd been drawing from for 3 years without giving anything back. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad," he said quietly. "The money, the cards, all of it. I knew things were tight, but I didn't." He left the sentence unfinished. I wanted to say didn't know or didn't look, but I held it back. "Ed, Sable says you're punishing us," he went on. "Says what you're doing is cruel." He was quiet a moment. "But I keep thinking about that summer I was 16 and you made me pull apart and redo that whole section of fence. Remember, I'd rushed through it so I could get out of there and meet friends. Every board was off, nails barely catching." I remembered. "You didn't say a word," Dalton said. "Just had me pull every nail, reset every board, work it through properly. I was furious with you." He paused. "That fence stood for 20 years. We sat with that for another 10 minutes. Nothing changed hands. No terms were laid out, no promises made in either direction. At 9 o'clock, he got up. "Thanks for opening the door," he said. "You're welcome." He walked out into the February night and drove away. Something between us had shifted, not resolved, not repaired, just moved. I didn't know yet whether it would hold, but something had moved. Saturday evening, I sat out back beneath a wide Texas sky moon, up air cool, the old porch swing. Noreen and I had bought 30 years ago, holding me the way familiar things do. I looked out at the garden she'd put in 25 years ago and let myself take stock. 6 weeks. 6 weeks since I'd walked out of that furniture showroom. Since I'd said no for the first time in 3 years. In those 6 weeks, I'd closed 4 financial accounts, changed 3 sets of locks, filed a living trust, revoked a power of attorney, opened a post office box, put cameras up, gotten my keys back, cleared my garage. The feeling wasn't anger. It was the particular tiredness that comes after a long day of honest labor, the kind that lets you sleep. My phone lit up on the armrest. Text from Reginald Thorne. Living trust is complete and registered. Your assets are protected. I set it back down and looked up at the February stars, bright cold, keeping their distance. For 30 years, I'd poured foundations meant to outlast me. This one legal quiet, invisible from the outside, was the most important I'd ever built. The smart locks were set. The cameras were running. The accounts were separated. The trust was filed and registered. The power of attorney was void. Every exposure closed. Every entry monitored. Every asset secured. I sat in the backyard with the phone dark beside me, the night sky overhead, and the knowledge that everything was in order. The fortress was built. What was left now was the waiting, because desperate people always move eventually. They moved 9 days later. They came on a Monday morning in early March. Dalton and Sable, carrying a leather folder, the color of money. Sable placed it on my coffee table with the kind of deliberate care you use when presenting something you believe will be signed. They were certain. I had known this moment was coming since the first lock was changed. Dalton sat next to her on the couch in business. Casual, hands folded, composed. Nothing like the worn-down man who had come alone 2 weeks before. This was the prepared version of him, the sales manager with a pitch. Sable had on a cream blouse and an expression of practiced concern. "Gerald," she began, her voice carrying that soft, engineered warmth. "We worry about you out here alone in such a large house. With things being tight economically, we thought if we moved in, it could work out for everyone. A real win-win. Win-win. Corporate language for a one-sided arrangement dressed up to look mutual. This is just a proposal," Dalton added quickly, "to make sure you're looked after as the years go on." I looked at the leather folder, expensive professional, the kind of presentation material assembled for a corporate acquisition. "Open it," I said. "I want to see the whole thing." Sable slid it across the coffee table with a smile. I opened it. The cover page read, "Family Care Plan" in clean serif type. Below that, Prescott Household Integration Proposal. Integration, not moving in. Integration. I turned to the next page, a detailed floor plan of my house. Every room labeled, but none of them carried the names they'd held for 30 years. Master bedroom, Dalton, Yassie's, Sable. Guest room, 1 home office. Guest room, 2 fitness room. A small bedroom next to laundry, Gerald. I sat with that for a moment. The room beside the washing machine. The smallest room in the house. The one we'd used for storage until Noreen converted it into her sewing room. That was where they'd put me, in my own house. I turned the page. Financial integration plan. A spreadsheet color-coded, professionally laid out. Gerald's monthly pension, $2,800 allocated to household utilities, $400. Groceries, $600. Property tax savings account, $500. Home maintenance fund, $400. Miscellaneous household, $900. Below that, a separate section, Dalton, Aja Sears Asparer. Sable current home rental income potential, $2,400 per month allocated to credit card minimum payments, $1,800. Personal savings, $600. I read it twice. They wanted my pension covering every household expense while they rented out their place and used that income to chip away at the debt they'd run up using my address. I turned another page. Credit card payment schedule. 5 accounts listed the same 5 I'd found envelopes for. Monthly minimums totaling exactly $800. Line item 14 tennis club membership, $500. Line item 22 spa weekend, $800. Line item 31 designer furniture delivery, $3,000. $1,000. My pension, earmarked to cover tennis memberships. I'd never held spa trips, I'd never taken furniture I'd never touched. They wanted the master bedroom, the room where Noreen died, the room where I'd grieved by myself for 2 years before they started draining my accounts. They wanted to sleep in that room while I sat next to the washing machine and handed my pension over to cover their credit card bills. I closed the folder with care, set it back on the table, and looked from Sable to Dalton. No, I said. Sable's smile held. Gerald, maybe you didn't read through the benefits section. Not one of the rooms I've slept in for 30 years, I said, cutting her off, my voice even in cold. You've claimed for yourselves. You've assigned me the room next to the washing machine. And my pension, you've earmarked it to pay off credit card charges that include $500 at a tennis club I've never walked into. But that's not Sable began. Sable, I ran a business for 35 years. I know a takeover document when I'm reading one. Dalton finally said something. Dad, it's not what you think. We're genuinely trying to help. Help, I said. By claiming my bedroom, allocating my pension, and assigning me to a storage room in the house I built with my own hands. Gerald, you're being dramatic, Sable said, her voice cooling. We're offering to care for you. I don't require caring for, I said. I stood up. And this house isn't available for integration. What does that mean? Sable demanded. It means this house sits inside a revocable living trust. I am the sole trustee. No one determines anything about it while I'm alive. And when I'm no longer alive, I've made my intentions very clear. You can go. The room went quiet. For 30 years, I'd built structures that couldn't be moved or taken. This house was no different from any of them. Dalton's face had gone pale. Dad. Now, I said. Sable stood, that manufactured warmth gone without a trace. You're making a mistake. You're going to find yourself alone in this big house with no one around when you actually need somebody. That's my decision to make, I said. She took her purse, walked to the door, without another glance back, her heels hitting the hardwood floor Noreen and I had refinished together in 1997. Dalton rose more slowly. He looked at me with something that could have been shame or might have been a recalculation. I'd stopped being sure which. I thought, he started. I know what you thought, I said. You were wrong. He gave a single nod and followed Sable out the door. The smart lock engaged behind them with a solid metallic click that carried through my empty living room the sound of a door that would not open to them again. The leather folder sat on the coffee table like something left behind at a crime scene. But people in that kind of desperation don't accept a single refusal as the end. 2 days later, I found out they'd been running a parallel track the whole time. Wednesday morning, my phone rang unknown San Antonio number. A pleasant woman's voice identified herself as Wanda Holloway from Summit Realty, calling about the property on Ridgecrest Drive, my address. Wanda Holloway, whose professional warmth carried no hint that she was about to hand me proof of what my son had attempted, explained that they'd received an inquiry from Dalton Prescott, who indicated he was acting on behalf of the owner. They wanted to schedule a walkthrough to assess current market value. When did Dalton Prescott contact you? I asked. My voice came out completely flat. I was standing very still in the middle of my kitchen. Let me check February 23rd. He said you were looking at selling and wanted a market assessment. February 23rd. 5 days before they walked in with the leather folder. They'd been lining up data on my house, preparing to move on it while I was still living in it. Ms. Holloway. I said, taking my time with each word, I am the owner. Dalton Prescott has no authorization to represent me in any capacity. I am not selling. I did not request any evaluation. Silence. Then, oh, I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Prescott. He seemed very... There's no confusion, I said. What there is deliberate misrepresentation. But I want to thank you for calling. You've been more helpful than you know. I ended the call and held the phone in my hand. Acting on behalf of the owner, my house, my name, my life, and they'd been speaking for me without my knowledge, positioning themselves as my representatives, shaping the narrative around a property that was mine and mine alone. I called Reginald Thorne right away. He answered on the first ring. I walked him through the call, repeated Wanda Holloway's exact words, and gave him the date Dalton had contacted the agency. Reginald was quiet for a beat. Gerald, if your carrier has call recording, we save that. What you just described is evidence of intent, claiming to act on a property owner's behalf without authorization that crosses lines. Civil at minimum and potentially criminal, depending on what he represented to them. What do I do? Nothing. Write it all down. Keep the agent's contact information. Leave the rest to me. What they did goes well beyond a family disagreement. This was systematic. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long while. The leather folder had been the pitch, but they'd been working in the background for weeks gathering property data, building a case, positioning themselves as my proxies. I'd nearly missed the whole scaffolding beneath it. Friday evening, the porch camera alert went off. One person at the door, Sable. She was holding a pie covered in foil. In her other hand, a small bunch of daisies, plain, inexpensive. Her expression had been arranged into something apologetic. Her eyes looked red as though she'd been crying, or wanted me to believe she had. She pressed the doorbell once softly, then looked up at the camera. "Gerald," she said, her voice quiet and measured. "I know I was wrong. I brought you something sweet potato pie. I just want to say I'm sorry." Sweet potato pie, the kind Noreen used to make every Thanksgiving, the recipe she'd refined over 20 years. The dessert I'd mentioned exactly once, 3 Christmases back, when Sable had asked me what I missed most about holiday meals. Even that detail was chosen deliberately. I sat in my living room watching the feed on my phone, watched Sable stand there with her pie and her flowers and her carefully prepared vulnerability, and let everything I knew pass through my mind. The leather folder, the bedroom assignments, the pension allocations. Opaline's overheard words. "Eventually that house will be ours anyway." 5 credit card accounts registered to my address. A real estate agent told that Dalton was acting on behalf of the owner. The laundry room, the tennis club charges, the measuring tape, every move, every approach, every attempt laid out in sequence. I pressed the microphone. "Sable," I said, "I'm not opening the door today." Her expression shifted the apologetic front, giving a little at the edges. "But I just wanted to—" "I know what you want," I said. "Have a good evening." I cut the microphone. She stood on the porch for another 30 seconds, mouth moving, saying things I couldn't hear and didn't need to. Holding that pie tray the way you hold an offering, a peace treaty, a Trojan horse wrapped in foil. Then she set the pie down on the porch step, placed the flowers beside it, and looked up at the camera one last time. I watched her face change. Watched the apologetic expression drop away entirely. Watched her understand that this, the final play, the tears and the pie and the daisies had come to nothing, just like everything before it. She walked to her car, got in, and drove away. The pie sat on my porch under the motion light. I remained in my living room as the last color left the sky. Camera screen dark, door locked, pie abandoned on the step outside. The house held nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of Opaline's sprinkler cycling on next door. No anger, no sadness, just the particular clarity that settles in after a long storm when you find yourself still on your feet. I'd built this house with Noreen 40 years ago, framed every wall, laid every plank, rolled paint onto every room. Lived through joy and grief and 3 years of slow-motion exploitation inside these walls, and I'd held it, not through force or cruelty, through boundaries, through locks and legal documents, and the clean, radical act of saying no. The leather folder still sat on my coffee table where Sable had left it Monday morning. I could have thrown it out, but I didn't. Evidence, proof, a record of exactly how far they'd been prepared to go. The worst of it was behind me, but worst doesn't mean last. One final test was still coming. Monday morning, at the post office, I opened my box to find a single envelope from First National Bank, addressed to Dalton Prescott, routed to my home, addressed the contact information he'd never updated or perhaps kept in place on purpose. I sat in my truck and opened it. Mortgage payment notice. Past due. Dear Mr. Prescott, this letter serves as formal notification that your mortgage payment of $3,200 for the period ending March 15, 2023 has not been received. Your account is now 30 days overdue. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in default procedures as outlined in your mortgage agreement, including potential foreclosure proceedings. I read it twice. The language was firm, but procedural. First notice, not final. Time remained. 3 months, Clifton had said, 3 months, maybe less. It had been exactly 3 months since we'd sat in that coffee shop booth. I didn't feel anything like satisfaction looking at that past due notice. What I felt was the weight of 39 years of fatherhood arriving at this particular moment. I folded the letter, raised my phone, and photographed it. Then I texted the image to Dalton. One-line Dalton mail from your bank came to my address. Sending you a scan. You need to handle this. No lecture, no told you so. No offer to step in. Plain information, no rescue attached. I hit send and drove home. 3 days went by without a reply. The silence said what I needed to know. He was sitting with consequences by himself, maybe for the first time. Thursday late afternoon, the camera buzzed. 2 people on the porch, Dalton and Sable. No leather folder, no pie, no flowers. Just desperation made visible in the way they carried themselves. shoulders pulled down, faces drawn tight. I unlocked the door from my phone. They came in and settled heavily onto the couch. None of the polished posture from the care plan presentation. This was something else. This was the look of people who'd run out of moves. "Dad," Dalton began, his voice worn rough around the edges. "The bank is about to send a default notice. We need—" I raised my hand. "I'm already aware," I said, quiet and even. "I'm listening, but I am not paying your mortgage." He closed his eyes and gave a slow nod, like a man who'd expected exactly that answer, but couldn't afford not to try. Sable leaned forward and I could see the calculation come back into her face. The last card. One more turn of the wheel. "Gerald," she said, her voice tight with manufactured urgency, "if you don't help us, we'll lose our house. And when we have children, we'll have to move in here. Is that what you want your grandchildren growing up without a home? There it was. The threat packaged as consequence. Obligation wearing the mask of family love. I let a moment pass. "Sable," I said, "that is your choice to make, not mine. If you have children, I'll be a very glad grandfather. But this house is not a financial solution for your situation. So you're just going to let us lose everything," she said. "I'm letting you make your own choices and live with where they lead. That's not the same thing. When does a father's love cross from protection into permission, from rescue into something that only enables the fall to go on longer?" I'd been turning that question over for 3 months. I still didn't have a clean answer, but I knew clearly that continuing to absorb their consequences wasn't love. It was partnership in their unraveling. Dalton pressed his face into his hands. The room went still, except for the ticking of the wall clock Noreen had picked out at an antique store in 1993. Then his voice came through muffled against his palms. "Can you show me how to find a financial advisor?" I went very still. Not "can you cover this payment?" Not "can you co-sign something?" Not "can you give us one more chance?" Can you show me how to find help? He lowered his hands and looked at me. His eyes were red. The exhaustion on his face was real. And for the first time in 3 years, he was reaching for a tool instead of a bailout. "Yes," I said. I got up, went to the kitchen, pulled out a notepad, and pen came back and sat down across from them. I wrote carefully, "Donovan Spear, financial advisor." Below it, a phone number. "Donovan helped me lay out my retirement planning 20 years ago," I said. "He's straight with people. He won't soften what he finds. He'll tell you exactly where you stand and exactly what needs to happen." I tore the page free and held it out to Dalton. His hand had a slight tremor as he took it. "It won't be comfortable," I said. "He'll ask you to do hard things, cut spending, sell things, maybe downsize, maybe take on extra work, whatever it takes to get out from under this debt." "Will he even take us on?" Dalton asked. "Given how much we owe, tell him I sent you. He'll see you." Dalton looked at the paper at Donovan's name written in my handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed permission slips and birthday cards and checks that kept 3 years of this going. "Thank you," he said quietly. Sable stood up sharply. "This is ridiculous. A financial advisor, that's all you've got. We need actual money, not a referral." Dalton looked up at her. Sable were leaving. Something in the way he said it made her go still. Something that hadn't been in his voice before. Something finished. They walked to the door together, but they weren't moving as a unit anymore. They were two people facing the same wall from two very different places. Dalton paused at the threshold. "Dad," he said, not turning around. "I'm sorry for all of it." "I know," I said. The door closed. The lock caught. On the camera, I watched them cross to their car without a word between them. I sat in the living room with the notepad still in my hand, a name and a phone number, Donovan Spear, the same advisor who'd helped me map out my retirement 2 decades ago. That was the only thing I put in Dalton's hand that day. Not money, not another lifeline, not one more year of borrowed air, just a name and a number. For the first time in a long while, it felt right. The seed was in the ground. Now I had to trust it would find its way up. That kind of trust, I've come to understand, measures itself in weeks, not days. 3 weeks after I'd written Donovan Spear's name on that page, Clifton called me from outside a client's office. He'd been scrolling through Facebook and come across something he thought I should see. "They're selling everything, Gerald," he said, no warm-up. "The sofa you walked away from that morning, listed at half price on Facebook Marketplace." I was at the kitchen counter making lunch, a simple sandwich. I set down the knife. "What else?" The walnut dining table marked sold. The crystal chandelier sold. That hand-knotted rug pending pickup. Everything they tried to get you to buy at that showroom. They're moving it all. I stepped to the back door and looked out at the garden Noreen had put in all those years ago. The roses were up. Late April in Texas color coming in from every direction. Gerald, Clifton said, "You still there?" "Still here." "Don't you feel," he paused, working for the right word, "satisfied?" I held the question. Thought about standing in that furniture showroom 6 months back, watching the total on that display climb. Thought about the leather folder and its color-coded pension allocations. Thought about 5 credit card envelopes arriving at my address. Thought about Sable on the porch with her sweet potato pie and her practiced red eyes. This wasn't the victory I'd pictured 6 months ago in that showroom. It was just people selling furniture they couldn't afford, learning lessons that came too late and cost too much. "I know," I said finally. "I just hope they're going to be all right." Clifton went quiet on the other end. "You're a better man than I am," he said. "I'm just a father," I said, "and I'm tired of being angry." We talked a few more minutes about other things. His wife's pregnancy was coming along well. His practice kept him busy. Normal life pressing forward for people who weren't drowning in financial collapse. After we hung up, I finished putting my sandwich together, ate it slowly at the kitchen table, looked at the empty chair across from me where Noreen used to sit. She'd have been proud of me, I thought, not for winning, for knowing when the fight was over. Memorial Day weekend came in late May. No call from Dalton, no text from Sable, no invitation to whatever gathering they were having, no blame for ruining their holiday, just silence. Complete silence for the first time in 3 years. I put together a modest meal Monday afternoon, nothing fancy. Grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, a glass of wine from a bottle I'd been holding on to. I sat at my table alone and let my mind drift back to Memorial Days past. Noreen making her famous potato salad. 12-year-old Dalton eating 3 helpings and angling for a 4th. The way we'd linger on the back porch after supper, watching the fireflies appear as dark crept in. Those days were behind us. Noreen was gone. That version of Dalton was gone. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, something unexpected settled over me. Peace. For the first time in 3 years, the silence wasn't in tension waiting to explode. It was just silence, the kind Noreen and I used to share on Sunday afternoons. Mid-afternoon, my doorbell rang. Opaline stood on my porch holding a pie dish covered with aluminum foil. "Sweet potato pie," she said. "I made 2. Figured you might like one." Nothing like the calculated maneuvering Sable had tried. Just a neighbor doing what neighbors do. "Thank you, Opaline," I said. "Would you like to come in?" "I'd love to." We sat on my front porch with glasses of iced tea talking about ordinary neighborhood things. Her winter snapdragons were coming in beautifully. My roses needed deadheading. The Harrisons 3 houses down were selling and heading to Florida. No drama, no crisis, no angle being played, just a quiet, easy afternoon between 2 old neighbors. She left around 4:00 p.m., and I carried the pie inside, cut myself a small slice. It was good, sweet but not overly so, the crust flaky and just right. Noreen's recipe had been different, but this was good too. I spent the evening out on the back porch reading, watching the sunset, taking in the neighborhood sounds. Children playing, dogs barking, somebody's grill, sending smoke drifting up the street. Normal life. The life I'd been defending without ever quite realizing it. I turned in early tired in that particular good way that follows a day of doing nothing much worth mentioning. The next morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand with the familiar ringtone I'd never changed. I reached for it, still half asleep. Dalton's name glowed on the screen. 6 months ago, I might have let it ring. Might have stared at it, weighing whether I had the stomach for whatever was coming. 3 months ago, I'd have answered with every wall already up. But lying there in the morning light, filtering through my bedroom curtains, I felt something different. Curiosity, not suspicion. Plain simple human curiosity about what my son had to say. I picked up immediately. "Dalton," I said. "Dad?" His voice sounded different. Tired, but not the ragged tired of a man going under. The tired of someone who'd been putting in the work. "Can I come over?" he asked. "I want to tell you something. No demand, no emergency, just a request." "When did you want to come?" "This morning, if you're free." I glanced at the clock. 7:30. I had nowhere to be, nothing on the calendar. Just another Tuesday in late May. "Come over," I said. "Thank you." He hung up. I lay there another minute, phone still in hand, turning it over in my mind. Then I got up, made coffee, and waited. Whatever he needed to say, I was ready to hear it. He showed up 40 minutes later. I heard the truck pull into the driveway, watched through the window as Dalton climbed out alone. No Sable. No leather folder. Just my son in work boots and a faded t-shirt, wearing a kind of tiredness I hadn't seen on him in years. The doorbell rang. I opened it. "How you doing?" he said. "Can I come in?" "Yes," I said. He followed me to the kitchen. I poured 2 cups of coffee without asking black for both of us the way we'd always taken it. Set them down on the worn table where Noreen and I had eaten breakfast for 30 years. Dalton sat down heavy, wrapping both hands around the mug. His hands trembled slightly. The same tremor I'd noticed before, but different somehow. Not nerves, just bone-deep exhaustion. When Dalton's hand shook around that coffee cup, my mind suddenly jumped back to teaching him to hold a hammer at age 7. We'd been building a birdhouse out in the garage. His small hands had trembled with concentration, trying to show he could do it, trying to make his father proud. The memory lasted 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and we were strangers again, at a kitchen table. "Donovan, he's the financial advisor, says 4 years," Dalton said, eyes fixed on his coffee. "Maybe 3 if we stick to it." I said nothing, just listened. We met with him twice. First time he just took everything in no judgment, no lecture, just notes. Second time he laid out the numbers. Dalton pulled a folded sheet of notebook paper from his pocket and smoothed it open on the table between us. Handwritten columns, debts minimums, income expenses. A timeline running 4 years with monthly targets marked out. "Sable's been picking up every Sunday open house she can get," he went on. "I'm working doubles Thursday through Saturday. We sold most of the furniture, the stuff from that day." He didn't need to spell out which day. We both knew. I looked down at his work boots under the table. They were genuinely worn, scuffed leather dust, worked into the seams. Nothing like the spotless props of someone playing at hard work. "It won't fix everything," Dalton said quietly, finally meeting my eyes. "I know that." The kitchen sat quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of Opaline's sprinkler system next door. I wanted to say something. Tell him I was proud he was trying. Tell him that walking through my door this morning took more courage than 3 years of keeping his distance. But the words caught in my throat, so I just nodded. We sat in silence another 10 minutes. Drank our coffee, looked at that handwritten debt repayment plan spread across the table like a map out of somewhere dark. Finally, Dalton stood. "I'll keep you posted," he said. "Okay," I said. He walked to the front door, paused with his hand on the knob, back still to me. "Thank you," he said, for the advisor's name. Then he was gone. I stood at the window and watched his truck roll away down the street, rounding the corner, where the oak tree leaned out over the stop sign. 3 weeks went by. I filled them, tending the garden Noreen had planted, pulling weeds from the beds she'd laid out, deadheading the roses she'd chosen. I bought paint and set to work on the back fence, the section facing the alley, gone weathered gray from 15 years of sun and rain. Slow, deliberate work, the kind that fills the hours without asking anything of your mind. Late June, early evening, I was kneeling in the garden, pulling weeds when my phone rang in my pocket. Dalton's name on the screen. I hesitated only a beat before answering. "Hey, Dad," he said. His voice was easy but genuine. "Got a minute?" "Sure," I said, settling back on my heels, brushing the dirt from my hands. "I was mixing concrete today," he said, "and I remembered something funny you said once about how it's like making pancakes. Too thin, and it's useless, too thick, and nobody can work with it." A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "I actually said that. Yeah, I was maybe 12. You were showing me how to patch the driveway." Sounds like something I'd say. A brief silence, comfortable, the kind that used to live between us before everything got tangled. "All right," Dalton said. "I'll let you go. Just thought you'd get a kick out of that." "Thanks for calling," I said, and I meant it. I hung up and sat in my garden as the evening light turned golden across the uneven lawn. 90 seconds. That's all it had been. He hadn't asked for anything, hadn't filed a progress report, hadn't come looking for approval, just shared a memory, just connected. I went inside and settled into my recliner. The same chair Noreen and I used to argue over on Sunday afternoons when we both wanted to read in the best spot. I lifted the framed photograph from the side table. Our 40th anniversary, 2 years before she got sick. Her smile real, her hand in mine. I thought about the night before she died, her hand paper thin in mine, her voice barely a whisper. She'd said, "Love isn't what you feel, Gerald. It's the consequence you choose to carry." I hadn't understood it then. I'd had love figured wrong. I thought it was a feeling, the warmth, the certainty that settles in your chest. But there in my living room, phone barely cool from my son's call, something clicked into place. This was a choice I was making. Not the old version of that choice, not bailing him out, not swallowing every lie, not leaving my checkbook exposed. Something different, carrying the belief that Dalton had it in him to turn things around, holding on to the idea that the man he might be in 4 years was worth betting on. Picking up the phone when his name appeared, not erasing what happened, not declaring us even, just deciding to leave the latch off the door. I put Noreen's photograph back where it belonged and headed out to the yard to get back to the fence. Brush in hand, working in long, unhurried passes, I saw it clearly. This wasn't the finish line. It was the first mile marker of 4 years or more, or perhaps the rest of my life. None of this had ever really been about whether Dalton paid me back. It was about whether I could look at myself squarely when the whole thing was behind me. That kind of recognition, I'd learned, isn't something you arrive at once and keep. You have to earn it every morning to face the mirror, remember the man you set out to be, and choose him again. 6 months of holding the line showed up on my bank statement. $4,800 saved, all of it mine. Early July, I pulled up the numbers at my desk. January through June, laid out in front of me. $800 a month, month after month. Measured against what I'd bled out, it was almost nothing. It barely registered on the larger wound. But I'd stopped thinking about it that way. What mattered now was that I was the one deciding where it went. I pulled up a blank document and sat watching the cursor pulse on the white screen. Then I started typing. Things I want to do before I turn 70. Visit Fredericksburg, track down the friends I'd been putting off for 5 years. Dust off the guitar sitting in the spare bedroom and actually learn it again. Stain the front fence so it looks like somebody lives here. Take that drive through Colorado, the one Noreen and I planned and never got around to. I saved it, named it my year, leaned back and read it over. When exactly had mapping out my own future started to feel like something radical? When had a list like this become a stranger to me? How had it all narrowed down to Dalton's crises, Dalton's debts, Dalton's next chapter? I'd spent 20 years generating documents, plans, estimates, spreadsheets, and every last one of them had someone else's name as the subject. Not this one. This one had mine. Middle of July, I walked into our regular coffee shop and found Clifton already at the table, something on his phone making him grin. He flipped the screen toward me without a word. Sable's Facebook. A quote rendered in flowing cursive across a golden sunset. Live below your means. Build the life you want, not the life you can afford to show off. 3 hashtags underneath. Financial freedom, debt-free journey, new beginnings. She's out here preaching fiscal responsibility, Clifton said, setting the phone down and shaking his head. Live below your means. You seeing this? I looked at the post a while. The sincerity of it. Someone publicly pledging allegiance to principles she'd spent years trampling underfoot. Could be she's serious this time, I said. Clifton gave me the eyebrow. Genuinely, not really my call. I pushed the phone back toward him. That's their road to walk. He folded his hands on the table and studied me. Dalton made sales team leader, he said. More on his plate, better money coming in. Sable landed 3 new clients in real estate last month. Word is, they're holding to the plan. Good. Short, clean, true. We wrapped our hands around our awful coffee and watched the sidewalk outside fill and empty. A couple of guys who'd been through the ringer with their families taking stock of a Tuesday morning. You know what I think, Clifton said, voice low. They're gonna pull through. Not on the back of anything you handed them, because you pulled your hands away. I gave him a nod and left it at that. I didn't trust what might come out if I actually tried to speak. We sat with it. That was sufficient. Late July afternoon, I was in my front yard with a paintbrush and a can of fence stain. Item 1 off my year list, the front fence. The heat was tolerable, the kind that sits on your shoulders without punishing. A faint breeze came through carrying the scent of Opaline's roses from the other side of the fence line. I'd had the brush going for 2 hours, methodical passes, the gray wood turning rich and even under each stroke. Opaline came around at the property line in her garden gloves, pruning shears at her side. She stood back and looked at what I'd done. Whole different feel, she said. Clean. Long overdue, I told her. She moved closer, and her eyes traveled past the fence to Noreen's rosebush at the yard's far corner, the one I'd stood over with a shovel 3 separate times, convinced it was finished. Look there, Opaline said, her voice dropping. Bud's coming in. little green tips forcing themselves up through the dry, knotted old canes. 2 full years, that bush had given me nothing. I'd written it off, just hadn't gotten around to admitting it out loud. But it had been working the whole time in its own way, on its own schedule. I'd smothered the thing with good intentions, constant fussing, endless correcting, spending all my energy trying to will it into blooming rather than trusting it to get there. Story of my life. You told me once you were a lucky father, Opaline said. She was still watching me. I held the brush where it was eyes on those small buds pressing through the old wood. Yet still hold to that, I said, though my understanding of it had shifted. Lucky doesn't mean raising children who arrive without trouble. Lucky means living long enough to watch them figure it out and finding the wherewithal to keep your hands to yourself while they do. Opaline's smile was quiet. She'd have been proud, she said, tilting her chin toward the rosebush. Noreen came into my mind. All those kitchen table talks about Dalton over the years. Her instinct was always to give it room. Mine was always to wade in. Could be, I said. Or she'd have looked at me and said I should have worked this out 3 decades back. Opaline laughed softly. Probably both. She turned back to her side of the yard. I turned back to my fence. That last board needed 10 minutes. Even passes, patient work, the kind that holds up. I stepped away when it was done and looked at the whole stretch of it. Solid, finished, mine. The house stood behind me, the one Noreen and I raised up together, the one I'd held onto when everything else was being carved away. Still standing. Still mine. Still the place I came home to. Supper waited on the counter. Nothing that required much chicken and vegetables I'd gotten ready earlier in the day. Quiet food for a quiet evening. I chose it. I carried the paint can back toward the garage and the gate eased shut at my back on hinges I'd tended to just last week. I kept walking, not fleeing anything, moving towards something, the life I'd reclaimed, mine to live on terms I set with a clear head and a heart that still had love in it, just held differently now, with more wisdom about where it belonged. 3 months shy of 70, a son grinding through a 4-year debt repayment plan, a daughter-in-law posting motivational quotes, a fence freshly painted, a garden coming back to life on its own, a file named my year sitting on my hard drive full of things I intended to do. No tidy bow, no storybook close. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. It means more than you know. This story cost Gerald years of his savings and something harder to measure the version of his son he'd believed in. What he got back wasn't what he lost. It was something quieter. Clarity. The knowledge that a man can be wronged down to his foundation and still choose who he wants to be when he stands back up. I believe God doesn't waste those seasons, even when they break your heart. The Lord's timing put Opaline at that fence, put Clifton across that coffee shop table, and put Gerald alone in that kitchen long enough to finally see straight. If this family revenge story taught me anything worth passing on, here it is. First, document everything. Money given without a paper trail is a story only one person controls, and it won't be you. Second, love is not the same as funding someone's avoidance of consequences. Real love sometimes means letting the bill come due. Third, when someone shows you the plan they have for your house, your pension, and your future, believe them the first time. Fourth, for adults, 50 plus, who feel the pull to keep the peace at any cost, your peace matters too. Protecting what you built is not selfishness, it is wisdom. If any piece of this story sits with you, leave a comment below and tell me what stood out. And if you know someone carrying a weight like Gerald's, share this with them. Sometimes hearing that someone else found their footing is exactly what a person needs. Subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you're here for the next one. I'll be back soon. Thank you, and take good care.